And welcome once more to the Open Door Show from Property CEO. And of course, as you can see, I'm here on my own again. No, Mr. Ian Child, he's off. I don't know what he's doing. Maybe he's on furlough. Who knows? I thought furlough scheme had finished. If you'd like Ian to come back, then please do message us. Well, we're not going to give you an email address because no one really wants him coming back. But, you know, find an email address, message us if you really want him to come back on the Open Door Show, and I'll see what I can do. As always, we're going to take a deep dive into the world of small-scale property development over the next 30 minutes. And I'm very pleased on today's show, we've got a great friend of mine who I've had the pleasure of spending some time on some professional panels in the industry, advising people how to get into small-scale development and what's hot, what's not. So on this week's show, we have got James Hutchison from Corbil Planning Ltd. James, welcome. How are you?
Doing very well, thank you, Ritchie. Yourself?
Yeah, very good, my friend, very good. And so those that are listening to this, James and I spent some time. So Property Investor Show up at Excel, great event. If you haven't been, then go and check it out. Everything to do with properties there. And we had a lot of fun, James and I, with a few others on professional panels, as I say, with audiences coming and giving a view on where we thought the market was at and what was going on. So I saw James there and I thought, you know, this is a guy that knows his stuff. I wanted to get him onto Open Door, and I'm very pleased that he's able to join us for today's session. Now, James, you're, if I'm right in saying you're a chartered town planner, you've worked on the other side of the fence in the local authorities and indeed in your own practice. You've been around for about 12 zillion years. Give us a bit of background. Tell us what you've done and how you've got to be in Corbil Planning.
Sure. So as you say, I'm a chartered town planner of the RTPI. I started around 20 years ago working in a local authority as a junior level. And that was in Surrey, and then I worked my way up through sort of senior management levels in West London and in Sussex. I then joined a large plan consultancy in London, Ralph Judd, that specialise in developments within the London boroughs, and worked there on various schemes before deciding to set up my own business, Corbil Planning. And that's been running for about 6 years now. And yeah, and it's been great working with, you know, sort of small, medium developers across probably, you know, most of London and South East, putting schemes together.
And what was your reason, James, for you know, coming out of local authority and eventually wanting to set up your own practice?
I mean, the local authority, I think you're either suited to work in a local authority or you're not. It's become increasingly difficult over the years in terms of your ability to react with applicants and agents and sort of formulate schemes, and also politics is quite difficult to handle if you're not that minded. So that's the reason for leaving local authority. Went to a big London practice, had a great time there, doing some decent big schemes. But ultimately, I think I just wanted that bit more control over the sort of the work that I was doing and managing the clients, and probably in terms of my own personality, maybe not so suited to the corporate lifestyle, but sort of having that control and ownership over your own practice and future, I found to be more appealing. So hence the reason I'm starting up Corbil Planning. Yeah,
I guess when you're running your own business, as you're the managing director of Corbil, you get to do the bits you want to do. As you say, if you in a big practice and definitely local authority, you could be tied up in the corporate politics, and that's not really what you signed up for, was it? You know, that's not what you got in the industry for.
That's exactly it. Yeah, you can control what you're doing, and and what you're going to be, you know, your future a lot more within your own practice.
You can just argue with yourself each day. That's all you got to do, isn't it?
Well, that's just it, and I do that frequently. Often I give myself a good talking to. But yeah,
great stuff. Look, obviously, please do reach out to James. We'll give you some details at the end of the show. Of course, that's if you like to like what he says in the show. We're going to talk about planning, and it is an integral part, and perhaps the most fundamental part if you want to get into small-scale property development. Because, you know, without planning or understanding planning, whether it's through the full planning route or whether it's permitted development rights, we're going to talk about all those things on today's show. You need that part to actually get to the other side before you can think about getting your structural engineers and maybe your architects and so on board. So we're going to talk about, you know, what's hot in planning, what you should be looking at, where you should be going. We're probably going to cover permitted development rights. So James, kick off. Where would you see a really good opportunity for people either in property looking to do something or people brand new starting? Maybe some areas that people don't even think about. Where would you say a good place to start looking?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of people who are just starting out look at permitted development rights, and obviously we'll come on to that because that's quite straightforward and it doesn't involve too much tackling with the local authority. One aspect that I look at a lot is housing land supply. So what councils are meeting their housing targets, what councils are achieving enough completions, and if those councils are falling behind, then it opens up an opportunity and tilts the playing balance in your favour when you put a housing application in. And that can lead to some quite successful projects where perhaps you might not be looking. And I see that to be quite a good opportunity at the moment.
So all local authorities have to deliver their agreed numbers with the government. They've got to agree a certain amount of housing. Is this each year, every 5 years? What is it? How does it work?
So there's two basic tests that they need to meet. The future 5 years, they need to demonstrate they have enough supply, and the previous 3 years, they need to demonstrate they completed enough to meet their housing requirements. And if they fall short on either of those, it has repercussions in terms of decision making. And
what do they get shot? Do they get hung, drawn, and quartered, or what? Or is it a budget cut?
Oh no, it's no accountability like that. But it's so the biggest penalty is what's called the presumption in favour of sustainable development. Essentially, what that is you take the planning balance, which is adverse impacts versus public benefits, and on a local authority that's meeting their target, their level, basically on a balance. If the council is not meeting their housing targets, then it gets tilted in favour of public benefits. Okay. So before you even assess the application, you tilt the balance like that, which means you need substantially more significant adverse impacts to pull it back the other way. So essentially, it's give you that advantage when you put your application in.
But what's the implications to the local authority? Is it political in terms of voting, or what repercussions if they don't deliver this housing?
Essentially, they lose control over being able to refuse schemes that perhaps they might not like, because they're starting from a more difficult position. In a lot of boroughs in the countryside, it means that, say, every town has got, or village has got, a boundary around it. It relaxes those boundaries, which means that you can look at greenfield sites that are technically outside the built-up area. Whereas before, if your council were meeting the housing targets, they don't need to look at sites outside the built-up area. So you're looking at cheaper greenfield sites as potential development opportunities then, whereas before they wouldn't exist.
So interesting. So we all know that all politicians don't want to lose power. So that's ultimately what they lose. So there's a real incentive. So trying to find these sites or these local authorities that aren't fulfilling, what I think you're saying, James, if we find them, then even on a full planning application for some new residential properties, they're likely to be in favour because they've got to meet these demands. How do we find these sites? Is it really through people like yourself, or can people go and do this themselves?
They can go and do things themselves. I mean, there's various different online platforms that you can use to site find. In terms of finding local authorities that are struggling, there's we've got a map on our in our news section on our website, and it's a map of England, and it's got colour coded, and it shows which local authorities are meeting their targets and which aren't. So if you find those local authorities that aren't meeting their targets, then you can draw your attention into those geographic areas, and then you can look at certain, site finding tools as you would ordinarily to pick off development opportunities.
That's really interesting. So this is an area. So whilst a lot of new developers would steer towards permitted development for the obvious reasons, I think what we're saying here, if you can target one of these local authorities that really needs to build some housing with a good scheme, with the right type of scheme, then you've got a big chance of getting through that.
Exactly. Yeah, it automatically puts it into your, in your favour. As you rightly say, you've got to have the right scheme. You can't, stick anything anywhere. It's not a, free card to go and do what you want with it. But as long as you put the right sort of scheme together, it certainly puts you one step ahead. So
if either students of ours or anyone watching this Open Door show wanted to connect up with you, you could obviously you could help them. There's a map on your website. We give your website details out later for them to actually go on and have a look. But then I would say it's probably essential to work with someone like you to not only interpret that map to see how they're falling short, where they're falling short, but also the right type of scheme that's likely to be acceptable. That's the sort of thing you can help with, I'm guessing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So a lot of the work that we do is feasibility. As an aside, the most important part of planning is feasibility, in my view.
Okay.
That's the most. It's the cheapest. It's but it's the best value that you're ever going to get from you use a plan consultant or any sort of professional. So you would target through that feasibility. You would target the right sites in the right areas.
When you say feasibility, is this a study that you do as a consultant, or is this you engaging with the local authority and getting them to assess the feasibility of the scheme?
It's primarily as a consultant. We provide reports to clients on the sites that they found and the properties, and it's basically just a short report saying yes, no, this is what you need to do to get planning. So it's almost like pre-application with the local authority.
Yeah,
but it's obviously done privately, and it's taken a lot of the place of formal pre-apps with local authorities, where local authorities are under-resourced and can't provide that service at the moment.
And for those that don't know, firstly, what is a pre-app? And secondly, what do you think of pre-apps?
So a pre-application is a informal submission that you make before you make a formal planning application, and it's to ask the council's view on whether or not they're likely to support your scheme were you to put an application in. My view on pre-applications are...
You're smiling now, I can see. That's why I was interested to get your view.
Yeah, it's fairly well documented. I have a very low opinion of most pre-application services for local authorities run. Back in the day when I worked in local authority, we used to get the agent, the architect in, sit around a table in the cafe, and we'll get the tracing paper out and we draw a scheme, and we can really work with them. And what you get is pretty much what you're going to get permission for. Nowadays, it gets handed down to junior officers. It takes as long as a planning application. It takes the same fee as a planning application. Why not just submit a planning application? So the pre-application, unless you've got some very specific policy point or something that you need to address, and local authority is resourced enough to deal with it, I would probably steer away from a pre-application.
And they've got no legal standing, have they? So they can, in a pre-app, am I right in saying, James, in a pre-app, they can say, yeah, what a fantastic scheme, we're going to support it. You put a full application, they reject it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. There's a disclaimer on the bottom of every pre-app letter that says it's an informal, non-binding opinion.
Yeah, interesting. I like the way you steered your way through that. I just say they're not worth the paper they're written on. So yeah, don't waste your time. I think, although I think they used to have a number of London boroughs insisted on pre-apps before they did anything. I don't know if that's still the case with some local authorities.
There are a couple of local authorities that almost insist on it. Ultimately, you can't insist on a pre-application before. You can't turn away a planning application without a pre-app. Yeah. So it's not something they can strictly apply. A lot of local authorities have got roundabout ways of trying to make you do a pre-application. Yeah. But ultimately, nothing can stop somebody putting a planning application in.
Interesting. Okay, so we talked about perhaps for a lot of people, this unknown opportunity for targeting these local authorities that aren't delivering the housing. So that's interesting. Let's go on to permitted development rights, because there's a huge buzz around permitted development rights, and rightly so. I mean, they've been around a long time, but they're receiving a huge amount of press, a lot of changes in the last few years, lots of permitted development rights. Are there one or two that you would say, if you're starting in development, or even if you're in development, these are the ones you should go for?
Yeah, essentially the permitted development rights that allow you just to convert the existing building. So I'm talking commercial to residential, class MA, class G, doing upper flats. Basically, where you take the existing building and you just change the use. That's the most straightforward permitted development right you can use. There are a lot of other permitted development rights, sort of airspace extensions and so on, but they're tricky to interpret, and local authorities can, bat you away with all sorts of design and other subjective views. But I would stick to, if you're starting out, you just want to use PD to get to get started, you can go wrong with a basic Class MA or a Class G permitted development, right?
So just so people understand MA, okay, MA is the letters that depict the permitted development right. What sort of buildings can we convert that are commercial, from commercial into residential? What sort of buildings are people looking for? Perhaps we could just describe that for the listeners.
Yeah, so a Class MA would take commercial, so it might be an office, it might be a shop. That's the most well-known one. Is probably a shop or an office. It can include certain, referring back to, say, change the use class over, but what used to be called D1. So that's sort of your nurseries and your sort of fitness centres, things like that, that you can also apply Class MA to. There was a great one I drove past the other day. It was a bank, an old bank building. That's banks are going online now, so there's a lot of opportunities. Well, they have been going online for a long time, but so banks is another one. But yeah, it's basically anything within what's called Class E. So if you Google or go on Planning Portal, you put in Class E, and it will give you a list of uses, and those are the ones you can do a Class MA change use on.
So the use class is Class E. That's the use class of the building, and anything within use Class E. And as you said, there's banks, there's shops, there's nurseries, there's gymnasiums, even light industrial buildings are in Class E, aren't they?
Yeah.
All of those we can convert to residential under this permitted development right MA. But that permitted development right just gives us the right to change the use. Obviously, if we take, let's say, a light industrial building and it needs windows and things, does the permitted development right give us the ability to put new windows and stuff into these buildings?
No, it doesn't. No, so it's just basically taking the existing building as it is. Windows is a very good point that you made, because you need to demonstrate natural light to habitable rooms, and you need to demonstrate, sort of reasonable internal lit space within the building. So windows are going to be key to, and the depth of rooms as well is going to be key to your assessment.
So getting adequate natural lighting to make a really nice living environment, that's something that they will assess us on. And that application then to put windows or change the roof or do other things like that would have to be a full planning application, wouldn't it?
That's correct. Yeah, you would need to make a full planning for that. Yeah,
but I'm guessing my view on that is that actually because a lot of people say, oh, well, hang on a minute, what's the point of permitted development rights? But the controversial thing is often the change of use and the actual changing of the elevations with some new windows and bits and pieces, providing it's done with what we might call in character. That should be fairly non-controversial. Would that be fair?
Yeah, yes, I think that's a fair point. I mean, there's limits as to where you can put windows in terms of overlooking and so on, but that'll be controlled anyway. But yeah, it's usually non-controversial for physical alterations to buildings.
So we've got this permitted development right. What makes this then, for people that's listening to this, easier than a full planning application? What makes it easier? Surely we have to still put an application in, which I believe is called a prior notification, but what makes it easier?
So first of all, you're reduced in terms of the prior notification application that you refer to is a reduced set of requirements. So it only looks at a certain number of things. The main thing with commercial to residential is if you just made the planning application, you need to demonstrate that the commercial use has been marketed for 12, 18 months before you're allowed to convert it to residential. That's a planning policy that most local authorities have to ensure they always have enough commercial floor space in their borough. So
that's under a full application. That's what you'd have to do. Exactly.
So you don't need to do that through permitted development through using a Class MA. You would also you also won't need to pay affordable housing contributions and other planning contributions. You'll still need to be liable to SIL, but you wouldn't need to pay sort of other contributions as part of the permission. It's an 8-week application period. So whereas a local authority, if you submit a planning application, there's a reasonable chance it'll be spun on and on. At least you'll actually be ensured that you got that decision within that sort of 8-week period. So there's a lot of benefits and it's a lot straightforward.
They're obliged to give you the response, aren't they, within 56 days?
That's correct. Yeah. So it's a deep. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. And then in terms of the things they can check you against, as you say, national, local policy doesn't come in. There's just a handful of things. And there'd be things like, as you say, adequate natural light, contamination, flooding. There's a few issues. Traffic and highways impact assessment comes into it, doesn't it? But once we tick those boxes, there's nothing else that they can really assess us against. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. So it's a very limited number of issues that you need to address. And subject to, and this goes back to the feasibility, subject to choosing the right site that ticks all those boxes. And it's quite a straightforward thing to sift through the list and make sure that you're ticking all those boxes in the first place. Provided you've got that site and it meets those requirements, it's a straightforward process to get the consent to change of use.
Yeah. So rather than wait, as you say, something being spun on in a full application, you've got the certainty that you can get on with it. And of course, the great thing is, we're not really talking about finance today, but because you've got permitted development rights, the finance will come to the table. So you can borrow up to 70% of the purchase and 100% of all the construction costs to develop it out, all the professional fees and so on. So because it's got these permitted development rights. We talked about SILC, which is community infrastructure level, and you talked about that might apply. But I'm also aware some local authorities charge it, some don't. And I think that's a bit of a mishmash across the country, isn't there?
Yeah, so there are exemptions. I mean, generally speaking, unless you've got a property that hasn't been occupied for a significant period of time, you're probably actually going to be avoiding SIL. It'll mainly come in with other PD rights. Yeah. But it's something just to be wary of. But certainly with regards to, and I can think of a few local boroughs in Surrey and West London where they have an affordable housing policy where they're going to try and hit you for quite a sizable plan contribution, even for one unit. You're going to sidestep that and you're going to avoid that. And that's going to be a significant saving to you if you can use these MA PD rights.
And MA and G, we mentioned MA and G. What's the difference between permitted development right MA and permitted development right G? They both enable us to convert that list of commercial buildings that we were talking about. What's the differences?
Well, they both require a prior approval process. Class G is taking the upstairs above sort of retail units and creating two separate flats out of those that floor space above retail space.
And I think also fundamentally, am I right in saying that Class G is the only permitted development right that you can actually use in listed buildings? Because you can't actually use MA in a listed building, which is a Grade 2 listed building, but Class G you can. That's
correct. Yeah. So it's fairly unencumbered. You can use it anywhere. It's quite a versatile PD right.
Okay, so what we're saying to people is focus on MA and G, but we touched on just now some other permitted development rights. We talked about airspace and where we're changing the building. So airspace has been a lot of discussion last year and this year about airspace, and let's do airspace, which is extending up on existing buildings, which is permitted development right AA for commercial buildings. And there's also a demolition and rebuild, which is permitted development right ZA, where you can demolish a commercial building and rebuild it as a residential scheme. But you're saying steer clear of those. Can you just perhaps tell us why?
So the prior approval process that we mentioned is, well, first of all, you need to meet a list of physical requirements with regards to the building, and that becomes quite a difficult list with regards to extending upwards, for example. The prior approval process, which is if you meet all those requirements, you then need to go to local authority with a prior approval application, and that usually includes it will include a design and appearance requirement, and there's subjectivity that creeps in at that stage as to whether or not the development is in keeping with the character of the area or the existing building, and that basically allows local authorities to get a foot in the door and use some subjectivity to back you away. So it's a lot more complicated to get the right building to fit the requirements, and then it's another task as well to convince a local authority to give you that consent.
So as you say, the MA and the G don't have really much, if any, subjectivity in it. But when we go to AA and ZA, the appearance of these buildings, the local authority can have an opinion, and just because their opinion is different, they could stop us developing. As you say, they could bat it back. Even if we don't agree with it, we think it's the best scheme ever, their opinion still counts. It doesn't matter, does it? They can bat us away.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, if you're a loghouse with local authority, the only route you've got to is appeal, and you have got the rights to appeal. But the planning inspectorate is very bogged down at the moment. You could be waiting best part of a year to get that decision, and that's going to play havoc with your timescale. So, and then you're relying on again the subjectivity that the planning inspector's got about design. So it's a lot more risk. It's a lot more risky proposition doing these upper extensions and replacement buildings.
Yeah. And am I right in saying as well, James, there is also a commercial element of subjectivity? Do they talk about this new extension, this new residential block that you're going to create extra floors, or the brand new residential block? They talk about, I'm sure there's some wording I recall about the sort of, the commercial impact. They don't say whether it's a good impact or a bad impact. It's just the impact of this development in this area on local businesses and things like that. And that's all very subjective as well.
Yeah, it is, and that primarily applies to the changes of use prior approval through particularly conservation areas is a significant one. What is the impact of this on the area? And then you get into the grounds of, well, what criteria are you applying to make that judgment? Is it how many retail units have you got in the row of 10 shops or 10 premises? It's very difficult to quantify. Using objective analysis, which really you want, because that's how you formulate a decision. It's very difficult to get to the right conclusion and to have two people thinking the same.
Yeah, and so your best advice in the world might hope something's going to go through, but if I was slightly cynical, I would say if the local authority didn't want it to go through, a local planning officer, then they would just have the opposite view to you.
Exactly, yeah, and that frequently happens. Or a lot of local authorities apply their policies. The local plan policy. So there's a certain case law that says you can only apply the policies in the national framework, i.e. the central government's policies. A lot of them use their own local policies. I have one West London borough that refused on the issue of highway safety because a number of bike stands there were. And but you can't get over that sort of judgment. They will try and use what they can if they don't like it. Yeah, they'll use what they can to throw a book at you, even if it's something ridiculous like bicycle standards.
Yeah, and as you say, if you then want to go down that appeal route, that's really just not. There's no appetite for that as a developer, because we want to get on. We need to turn projects out. We need to make money, particularly if you're starting out in this game. You don't want to be tying up a site, even if you've got it on an option, spending money, and still a year later sat there not any further forward. Okay, so we talked about permitted development rights, the good ones, the bad ones. We talked about looking at housing supply areas where they're underperforming. We just had a brief conversation before we came on air today. Greenbelt. You mentioned something about Greenbelt. Could you just perhaps talk about, can you develop in the Greenbelt or can't you?
Yeah, so taking a basic policy position, you can't put new residential development into the Greenbelt. You can't put new commercial development, apart from the rules, exceptions and so on, into the Greenbelt. Where permitted development rights have a significant benefit is you take a residential dwelling and you want to extend it. Greenbelt policy says that you can't extend it, the property disproportionately, and it will compare it back to the original building as it was in 1948 or when the Greenbelt came in. And some local authorities say a disproportionate addition is anything over perhaps 10%, looking at Bromley, for example. So you can't extend the property more than 10%. So if you've got a property that's 150 square meters, you can't put much more, you can put a boot room onto it, and then you've maxed out your rights to extend the property. Using permitted development, that doesn't apply. It doesn't, the Greenbelt policies and local plan don't apply. You only need to make sure that you comply with the legislation, and that's the size requirements. So you can, for example, on a detached bungalow that's 150 square meters, you can extend 8 meters out the back. So, your rear elevation is, 10 meters. You can put 80 odd square. It vastly exceed what the local authority plan policy will allow you to do. And with the upward extensions as well, on the main part of the existing building, using the new permitted development rights, you can take the footprint of the existing, say, a bungalow, you can take that footprint and you can put another floor on top, 100% addition to the existing building under permitted development. and you don't even have to tackle greenbelt policy.
Wow.
As long as you meet those key requirements in the legislation, you can vastly extend a property in the greenbelt without, relatively simply. And a lot of this is stuff that you can just go out and crack on with tomorrow, because you don't need to make a planning application for it.
Yeah, so this is all under purely residential permitted development rights, which don't even need a prior notification as we do for the commercial conversions.
Yeah, some of them. So that you can significantly extend an existing property using permitted development. Talking about the larger rear extension, you can put an 8-metre extension onto detached house as long as your neighbours don't object. You need to do this prior notification application, but the only criteria that you're going to get assessed on is the impact on neighbours, and that only gets applied if your neighbours object. So as long as you
you're going to send a hamper around for Christmas to the neighbours.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
keep them sweet.
Yeah, and the upper extension, put another floor on top of your house without needing a planning application. It's a significant increase in floor space and the value of the property by exercising those rights.
Great stuff. James, I think we've covered some fantastic ground today, and anyone that's listened to this, I mean, we've given you, and James has given you some really key areas. One which is largely overlooked, which is where local authorities, local boroughs are underperforming in their housing supply, and get in there. Obviously, we'll give you his website in a minute, because there's a bit of a heat map on there that obviously you can delve into and have a look. We talked about Class MA and Class G permitted development rights, where you can convert a whole raft of buildings all under what we call Use Class E. And we touched on reasons why you don't want to do extensions of commercial buildings up, airspace conversions, or demolition and rebuild to residential, because of this subjectivity going on. And of course, some great opportunities there in the Greenbelt. Lots of interesting stuff. James, that's been absolutely fantastic today. Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll get you back another time, I'm sure. If people want to contact you, first of all, what's your website? So I'm sure there's going to be people listening to this want to dive straight onto your website. What's your website details, James?
Sure. So the website is www.corbilplanning, so one word, .co.uk.
And Corbil spelled C-O-R-B-I-L, yeah? Corbil Planning, okay?
That's correct, yeah.
And if people want to reach out and contact you, because I think that sort of feasibility approach is absolutely imperative. And if you want to have a chat with James about some of these areas around the country, and what you could put on them, and I'm sure James will have a pretty instant idea of the best authorities to tackle, where the easiest routes are. James, what's the contact details for people to get in touch with you?
Sure. So you can email to administrator@corbil.co.uk. Alternatively, happy to send to myself at james.hutchison@corbil.co.uk. A phone number, I'll give my own number, more than happy to be approached. It's 0751 798 0401.
Just mention your phone number again, if you can, James.
0751 798 0401.
Hopefully your phone will be ringing. Not the time. Please don't ring James if you listen to this as it's released on YouTube at 7 o'clock on a Thursday, because he might be having his feet put up, or maybe playing with the kids, or whatever he's doing, having a glass of wine. We'll put James's details in the show notes. James, thanks for coming along. It's been really interesting, and hopefully the audience out there have found this interest as well. James, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Richie. Cheers.
Wow, wasn't that good? I mean, hopefully you thoroughly enjoyed that. I mean, a real good insight on those areas. Think about that Class MA, think about that Class G, and those other areas, those local authorities, that heat map. Please dive onto James's site. And of course, think about some of those residential greenbelt developments. If you're new to development and you're interested to dip your toe in the water a little bit more, if you want to come and spend a bit of time with me, I have put together a bit of recorded training available for a limited amount of time. It's just about 2 hours long. It'll just give you an introduction to the world of small scale property development. Grab a pen and paper and I'll give you some details for it. You're more than welcome to come and join me. propertyceo.co.uk/SFR. That stands for six-figure roadmap, because it's about going on a journey to earn a six-figure sum. So propertyceo.co.uk/SFR. Thank you for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed this week's show, and we'll see you again next week. Goodbye now.